Hi, welcome to this episode of the First Trust ROI Podcast. I'm Ryan Isakainen, ETF strategist at First Trust. Joining me on the podcast today is Bob Stein, Deputy Chief Economist at First Trust. Bob has a deep insider knowledge of what happens in Washington, having worked as the Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury. He was also the Chief Economist for the Senate Budget Committee. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what his take is on what's coming up in the elections of 2024, as well as what's going on in the economy. Is the economy likely to still head into a recession? Will that be a deep recession or a mild recession? And what are the odds that we do or don't tip into a recession? Very much looking forward to today's conversation with Bob Stein. I hope you enjoy it as well. Bob, thanks for joining us again. You are the second time guest on the ROI podcast so far, so appreciate you being willing to come on again.
I'm happy to do so. A little disappointed I wasn't the first second-time guest, but
I know.
Hopefully I could be the first third-time guest.
We'll see. We'll see how this goes. The conversation goes well. No, it's always great to get your insights. So there's two things I want to talk about with you today in particular, and we'll get granular on some of them. But I want to start off with the economy. I know you've got some interesting views that maybe are a little bit less consensus than they were a year ago. I also want to talk about the upcoming elections, and of course there's some intersection between those two topics. But I want to start off with the economy. Today's Thursday, January 25th that we're recording this. It's going to air on Monday. And this morning, we had a GDP print for the fourth quarter that was stronger than just about everyone expected. I think it was about 3.3%. I realize that can change with revisions going forward, but it's, I think, notably stronger than most people thought. So did that come as a surprise to you? And what are some of the reasons that things have come in stronger in general, maybe not specifically to this particular print?
Well, the GDP report came in at 3.3%. The consensus was 2.0. We were slightly higher than consensus, 2.1, just get a feel for it. The highest forecast from anybody that I saw, and there are like 80 economists who forecast this on Bloomberg, was 2.5. Mm-hmm. So this was like, in terms of standard deviations, way away from the norm. And it wasn't one particular part of the GDP report. It was a little bit of everything. It was death by 1,000 cuts. So consumer spending came in a little stronger, trade was a little stronger, inventory is a little stronger, which might detract from growth in the first quarter. So it was a little bit of everything. Mm-hmm. I wasn't shocked by anything when I went through line by line with the components of GDP, but it just added up to something that was substantially higher than anybody anticipated. It is subject to revision. For all of last year, all of 2023, the economy grew 3.1%, or it was 3.1% larger in the fourth quarter than it was a year prior. Mm-hmm. It's the best way of saying it, the most accurate way of saying it. That was on par with the roughly 3% growth we had in 2019 right before COVID. But I don't think we're going to have growth anywhere near that this year. And we are anticipating still a mild recession this year. Doesn't have to be earth-shattering. It doesn't have to send people to the bomb shelters or anything like that. Yeah. We're not going to see 15% unemployment or even 10. And we're talking about an increase of 1.5 to maybe at most 2.5% in the unemployment rate over the next couple of years.
That it'll tick higher, 1.5 to 2 percentage points higher?
Yeah. Okay. So if we bottom at 3.5, maybe we'll go up to 5%.
Okay.
Have a 5 handle on the unemployment rate at the peak. And I think it'll be mostly focused on the business side. I think the consumer will not remain strong. Consumer spending will continue to grow, but at a very slow rate. And I can see housing being okay. So in that regard, similar to the recession in 2001, mm-hmm. Where consumer spending held up okay, housing continued to grow, but business investment slowed down. Put yourself in the position of a project manager at a large or medium-sized business. You have some great project ideas, but then put yourself in the shoes of a financial guy for one of these companies, and you're going to say, well, great idea, but why do it this year when we can get 5.25% for doing nothing?
So you're saying like the hurdle rate is higher?
Exactly.
Okay.
Right. The hurdle rate would be higher, and there will be an incentive to postpone enough projects to be a headwind for business investment, and that'll kind of take the economy down. When the trend growth rate is between 1.5% and 2%, you don't need a calamity to have persistent negative growth for a few quarters.
So if you were to put odds on the likelihood that a recession happens in 2024, do you have a number that you would attach to that?
I'd say 60 to 65% at most. However, I'm glad you asked about percentages.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is that with each passing month this year, in the first half of this year, I would tick down those odds by about 5 percentage points.
Okay.
Because at a certain point, you have to gradually change your view based on incoming information. Kind of have, I don't hate to be technical, but like a Bayesian statistical framework. And so you have a starting point, and you gradually adjust the incoming information. It seemed like last year a lot of people were like, "Well, it's 90% certain," and then 6 months later they said, "Well, it's 90% certain we won't have a recession." If you move from 90% certain we will to 90% certain you won't, then something's wrong with the way you're forecasting.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this then. It seems, as you mentioned, time as the longer we go without a recession, maybe the lower probability of having a recession this year. Is there anything that you look at data-wise that would change your mind and make you less certain, apart from the passage of time, that a recession is likely this year?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at unemployment claims week by week, and so far they're okay. They're not in the territory that you would assume a recession would happen. So I'm going to continue to watch those, and if I see a continued low level, then I know that a recession isn't happening. In terms of, am I looking at any indicator that says, you know what, not only are we not in recession now, but we can't be in one for the next 3 or 4 months? I don't think there's a silver bullet like that. And so that's why I stick with my prior to somewhat, because the prior is based on the relationship between monetary policy and inverted yield curve, the real federal funds rate, growth of the money supply, and economic growth over a long period of time.
So there's that rule of thumb for recessions, and I know it's, you're an economist and you look at things slightly different than this, but that two consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth is sort of a rule of thumb for a recession. Yeah. And we had that in 2022. So have we already had a recession?
No, we didn't. That is a solid rule of thumb when you're teaching Econ 101 to 19-year-olds. However, during a recession, you would expect the unemployment rate to rise, for the total number of jobs or payrolls to fall, and for industrial production to be falling. We didn't have any of those in the first 6 months of 2022, at least on a consistent basis. And so we back then said, no, we're not in recession yet. And we got slammed a lot by people who wanted to be able to pin the recession tail on the Joe Biden presidential donkey. But we didn't think there was a recession.
That's a good pun. I mean, there's a Democrat, pin the tail on the donkey.
Exactly. So, but we didn't think there was a recession then. It doesn't mean we won't go into one, but we didn't think there was one back then. So the 2 quarters, it's a rule of thumb for people who have no other data. But we did have other data. Those indicated we were not in recession. Okay,
so one of the things that has maybe helped lift the economy, especially last year, has been some of the fiscal spending and some of the stimulus bills that were passed in 2021, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Act. It seems to me that if I was the Biden administration and I'm thinking I want the economy to be strong in an election year, I would put as much of that money into the economy as possible.
Absolutely.
Is that enough to keep things from tilting too much downward? Is that enough to keep us out of a recession?
Well, we had a quite large expansion of the budget deficit last year.
Right.
And it was very unusual to have that much of an expansion of the deficit, especially if you take out the effect on the deficit of the Supreme Court striking down the Biden plan on student loans, because that didn't affect the government's cash flow. Were it not for that court ruling, the budget deficit last year would have been 7.5% of GDP, which was up from around 5.5% the year before.
Right.
So that's a 2 percentage point expansion when the unemployment rate is 3.5%. That's unheard of. Unless we're at war. Okay, that'd be different.
Yeah.
But we're not in a full mobilization war or anything close. So it's very unusual, and I do think that postponed the recession last year, all that extra spending. However, unless they pass additional spending bills But I think that's extremely unlikely given the composition of Congress right now with the Republicans in at least thin control of the House. That budget deficit is not going to expand this year, at least from that adjusted figure for what the Supreme Court did. So if it was 7.5% deficit last year, it'll be roughly 7.5% this year. But even the absence of an expansion of the deficit can be a negative for economic growth if the economy became dependent on that, and I think to some extent it was last year. So I think there's going to be a fiscal headwind, if you will, for the economy and for President Biden this year.
I just heard you give a talk recently on sort of what the money supply's impact on inflation has been. So I guess more broadly, why don't we talk about that? Over the past few years, what has the money supply's impact been on inflation, and what do you think it's going to be this year in 2024? Okay,
I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth.
Okay.
But that's okay because I'm an economist. Yeah. We're allowed to. Professional courtesy. So we had a massive surge in the measures of a key measure of the money supply, the M2 measure of the money supply, which, by the way, did not surge during the Great Recession and financial panic. When some people were worried about hyperinflation, we never were. Okay, so we saw this big surge back in 2020 and 2021, and with a year lag, 2021 and 2022, we had high inflation. Well, now that kind of surge is dissipating, and with each passing year, it becomes less powerful for a variety of other reasons. And so this past year, we still had some excess M2 in the system, and we had higher inflation than normal, but not as high inflation as 2021 and 2022. And I think by the end of last year, when I look at the numbers, we had fully absorbed that excess M2 initially injected into the financial system back in 2020 and 2021. And so even though I think long-term over the next decade, inflation is going to be a bigger problem than it was in the decade pre-COVID, I think for this particular year, calendar 2024, at the end of this year, we will finish with inflation at or maybe even below the Fed's target.
Below 2%.
At or below. Yeah. So our call is really out of consensus. We're saying weaker real economic growth and lower inflation than the consensus anticipates. So that's slow nominal GDP growth, which is a headwind for profits.
So let's say that's true. What do you think that means for Fed policy? If inflation does come at or below target, I mean, do people start talking about risks of deflation at some point? Is the Fed going to be, what do you think the Fed is going to do this year, I guess?
I think there might be some people talking about deflation, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah.
Okay. If there's one thing the Fed does well, it's boost the size of the money supply when it wants to.
Right.
So what I think is going to happen is that, okay, actually, let me put it a different way. The market seems to believe that we're going to have moderate economic growth this year and a small decline in inflation, not fully back to 2%. And yet they simultaneously believe, the market, the futures market and federal funds in particular, believes there'll be 5 or 6 rate cuts this year.
Right.
That doesn't make sense. If we have moderate economic growth and inflation falls but not fully to 2, we're certainly not getting 5 or 6 rate cuts this year. Here's where I start talking out of both sides of my mouth, by the way. I actually think we'll get 6 rate cuts this year. So I think the market is right about the amount of rate cutting, but not the economic environment in which it happens. So I think the market's right about the amount of rate cutting because I think the economy will be weaker and I think inflation will be lower than the Fed's target. In that environment, you can certainly see 6 rate cuts later this year. Absolutely. So what I'm saying is that my forecast, the First Trust forecast for the economy, inflation, and the federal funds rate, that's internally consistent. The market's forecast for the economy and inflation on the one hand and federal funds rate on the other, that's inconsistent. And if we're wrong about the economy and the market's right about the economy, we are not getting those 6 rate cuts. Well, that might be a problem for the equity market at some point. And if we're right about the economy, even if we get the rate cuts, that might be a problem for the equity market, right? Because because you get the rate cuts, but it's because the economy is weaker than you anticipated, so profits should be lower.
Sure.
Either way, to me, that indicates a little bit of frothiness in the equity markets right now.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit, as I mentioned at the outset of our conversation, about what's likely to happen this year during the election year, some of your outlook there, and also how that impacts the economy. And I think a great place to start would be on the heels of Iowa and New Hampshire. We've seen some Republican candidates drop out. DeSantis just dropped out. At this point, as we're having this conversation, Nikki Haley, Donald Trump seem to be duking it out head to head. What do you think the odds are, I guess, starting with the Republicans, that Trump is the nominee?
I think 95%. And if you held a gun to my head and said I had to go higher than 95% or lower, I'd say a little bit higher.
Okay.
I think there's almost no chance that anybody else would be the nominee at this point. Haley's not going to win any state.
Okay.
Maybe Puerto Rico, not a state. Okay. So in the end, she's not going to be the nominee unless lightning strikes. President Trump has some sort of health issue or something that forces him out of the race. But put it this way, he's been indicted 4 times, and I'm giving a 95% chance of getting a nomination. If he's indicted a 5th time, I'll give him 110%. Okay. So he's invulnerable to the court system. I don't think he'll be convicted of any imprisonable offense, any felony until after the election. And frankly, he won't be convicted of anything imprisonable before he's nominated officially by the Republicans. And so in that scenario, I don't think it will be an impediment for him to get back into the Oval Office.
So do you think that Nikki Haley will, and I'm asking you to guess the future, I realize that, but do you think Nikki Haley will make it through South Carolina?
No, I don't think she sticks around to South Carolina because she doesn't want to be beaten in her own state.
Okay.
That's embarrassing.
Yeah.
So I think she'll get out before they get to South Carolina.
So
which is end of February.
If she does get out, does that do anything to some of the court cases? If Trump is the de facto Republican nominee, does that speed things up, or do they wait till he's officially nominated?
No, they'll wait till de jure.
Adjudicate it.
They'll wait till de jure nominee and actually officially nominated by the Republicans.
Okay.
Now, in theory, the Republican National Convention or National Committee could advance the timeline at their own discretion.
They don't have to wait till the convention?
They can nominate them in March.
Okay.
Like they could, in theory, do that. But that would take away all the suspense of the convention.
All the drama and
exactly.
cocktail parties.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about the Democratic side of the ticket. Joe Biden obviously is the incumbent. Typically, I would expect an incumbent to have a really high percentage of being especially he's gone through one term, he's likely to be renominated. Is that your expectation, or what are the odds that Biden is the Democratic nominee?
So I give Joe Biden, President Biden, an 85% chance of being his party's nominee.
So that's lower than your odds for Trump at this point.
Correct.
Okay.
It used to be Trump lower.
Yeah.
And the reason is because why is Biden not 100? And the reason is because if you look at the actuarial tables and plug in 81-year-old white male, and then add to that the possibility of some sort of Mitch McConnell-style moment or two before the cameras over the next 9.5 months, that's why he might not be the nominee.
So there's a risk of that.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why it's 85%, and he's not at 95%, because health-wise, he's not in as good a health as former President Trump.
So in the first time that you were kind enough to come on the podcast, I asked you about this, and you said that if Joe Biden drops out on April 18th, and I'm still waiting for that day to actually be the day that he drops out.
I think it was May 18th. May 18th. I'm not part of the deep state.
We can go back and look at the date, but I was wondering, if that happened, could there be some sort of conspiracy theory that's spun up that Bob Stein, deep state operative,
deep state Bob.
So as a bit of an aside here, I got to wondering, what sort of conspiracy theories do you, as somebody who's been an official at the Treasury Department, you've had these roles inside government, are there any that you look at and say, you know what, that could actually be true?
So I'm kind of boring when it comes to conspiracy theories. I have to tell you this right.
Maybe that's a good thing.
I think Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated JFK and acted alone. Okay, I think James Earl Ray assassinated Martin Luther King, although he might have gotten some financial assistance, but not assistance in like the actual deed. And I think Sirhan killed RFK. So I'm not like a big conspiracy guy. I'll give you one.
Okay. Red meat for the viewers here.
I do believe that civil servants in the federal government, senior civil servants in the health agencies of the federal government, along with officials and others at the major drug companies who are coming up with some sort of inoculation for COVID, as well as people in academia, did act in concert in a way to postpone the announcement of a vaccine until after the election in 2020.
So that
and so they were willing to deal with the fact that, that what should be on their conscience is that multiple thousands of people probably died because it was 1 week later.
Right.
Because of what they did, but they were so opposed to Donald Trump. They knew that if they just let it run its course, that Pfizer was going to announce late October, and so they changed the testing protocols to make sure it would happen in mid-November.
Interesting. I remember when all of that was playing out, thinking something similar to that. So it's interesting. I mean, the timing was right after the election, right? When they made the announcement.
A week later, and Pfizer was originally supposed to announce the results. When they devised the plan, it was devised so that the results would be announced in October, but it somehow got postponed. They changed the testing protocols.
Well, I appreciate you going down the conspiracy theory rabbit hole with me for a moment here, Bob. Getting back to the Democratic nomination, if Joe Biden were to drop out, who's the next in line? Is it still possible for someone outside of the administration besides Kamala Harris to be the replacement nominee if Joe Biden drops out, or is she the heir apparent, you think, in that 15% window?
If Joe Biden had dropped out 6 months ago, I think there are multiple candidates who get in the race, and Vice President Harris has very little chance because she's not a particularly good candidate. And so then the nominee is Gavin Newsom or Amy Klobuchar, or maybe a Newsom-Klobuchar ticket or something like that. But here we are, late January of the election year. And I think at this point, it would be too difficult for the Democrats to give the nomination to anyone other than Vice President Harris. People mention Michelle Obama, and apparently there are fundraising calls on her behalf being made by her husband about would you be willing to donate it. In the end, I don't think she has the fire in the belly. I might be wrong, but if you don't have the fire...
What do you mean by that? What's fire in the belly?
Fire in the belly, the desire for the job.
Okay.
You got to be a really strange person to want to be president of the United States. You have to have like a hole in your soul that needs to be filled by that position, or that you think will be filled by that position. And so I think in the end, she likes private life, and she doesn't like what it would do to her for the next 4 years. All the stresses, all the concerns, leading a completely public life, being criticized the way presidents are. And frankly, I think she's enormously popular today, but she wouldn't be as popular once she entered the race.
Okay. Have you thought about I'm sure you have thought about it, but the impact of a potential third-party candidate in whether it's RFK Jr., maybe Joe Manchin, somebody else coming into the race, and would that tip the scales one way or the other?
I think in the end, Joe Manchin's going to decide to take a pass, and I don't think RFK Jr. is going to have that much of an effect. A lot of conservatives like him now because he was very skeptical of the vaccine.
Sure.
What they don't realize is he also wants to throw people in jail for disagreeing with his position on climate change. So I think in the end, I don't think there'll be any candidate other than a Republican or Democrat who gets, as an individual, more than 5% of the vote.
Okay.
So I don't think there'll be a major, that's my threshold for a major third party. They might affect the outcome in certain states, maybe. I think a lot of the people who come out and turn out for third party candidates would not have voted at all in the election had it not been for the presence of those third party candidates. So people sometimes do the math wrong. And people have different reasons for supporting one person or another. Mm-hmm. And like in 2000, people said, well, if you add Nader's votes to Gore's, Gore wouldn't run easily. A lot of people wouldn't have voted if Nader hadn't been on the ticket. And a lot of people voted for him because, you were a manufacturing worker, like a retired manufacturing worker who liked Nader's stance on protectionism. He was the only protectionist in the race.
Yeah.
So people just assume, oh, Nader left, must have been a Gore vote. No, maybe 60-40 of half of the vote would have been Gore's.
I mean, I think back to Ross Perot and his impact on that election.
That was Bush Clinton in 92, and then I think he ran again in 96.
That had
a Dole Clinton, but didn't get as much.
So that may have had an impact on the results of that election.
There are some people that contend that. However, Clinton won the popular vote by about 5 percentage points. So Perot probably picked up more Republicans than Democrats. But I think he got 19% of the vote. And if you assume many of those people wouldn't have voted in the first place, and then the 60-40 split, he might have made a difference in some states, but he would not have shifted it, I think. His absence would not have shifted the whole thing back to Bush.
Okay.
I think Clinton would have won anyhow.
Okay, and that brings me to the Electoral College. Obviously, presidents are elected based on the popular vote in the national poll.
Thank God.
So as a result of that, we're at a point now where you've got some polarization, specifically with certain states, and it comes down to oftentimes a smaller list of states. How many states do you think are the decisive?
6.
6?
At most.
Okay.
So it's Georgia, Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and maybe Michigan.
Okay.
Those 6 states decide the race. If you're living in another state, you should go vote.
You should
it's the
go
right
vote.
thing to do, but you're not going to tilt the balance either way. Some people are saying, well, what about Virginia? Youngkin's pretty popular. I think in the end, in a close election, it still goes Democrat. If it does go Republican, it's probably because Trump is doing, or the Republican candidate is doing so well that the other states really aren't that close either.
Do you think there's any chance that Joe Biden has a different running mate?
No.
No?
No, because then he would have to admit a mistake.
Okay.
And to replace a minority woman on the ticket,
Okay.
he would have to have another minority woman. Maybe Michelle Obama for VP, but I don't think she would take VP either. So I don't think there's a natural successor to Harris. People don't like admitting mistakes. George Bush the elder never replaced Dan Quayle. Why? You'd have to admit a mistake. People don't like doing that.
Okay, so then let's focus on the Trump VP nom. Is there anybody in particular that you think is likely to float to the top, and would that help him potentially with some of those swing states?
Yeah, the candidate that does that, despite all of his recent comments, hostile comments about her, is Nikki Haley.
Interesting.
So I think in the end, Trump flirts with Kristi Noem from South Dakota. I think he might even flirt a little with Kerry Lake. But in the end, he'll marry Nikki Haley because she's the candidate that is most likely to put him over the top.
Okay, so beyond the presidential election, when you look at the House and the Senate, what's your outlook on either of those? And you don't have to get as granular. Feel free to get as granular as you want. But what do you think is likely to happen in those races?
So for the House, I think the Democrats have generally done a very good job of getting court decisions in their favor that enable them to redraw some of the district lines that will help them grab a few more seats in the U.S. House. Right now, the Republican margin is, I think they're up by 6 seats right today in the House, although there are 3 unaccounted for vacancies and things like that. So they don't have to gain very much. I give the Democrats a slight edge in taking back the House, given the redistricting, especially in New York State.
Interesting.
That said, if you condition the probability on a Republican win, on a Trump win of the White House, chances are the Republicans will win the House. Not definitely, but probably, if Trump wins.
Okay.
And if Biden wins, the Democrats are very likely to get the House.
Okay.
So
that
conditional probability, think of it that way. Okay. But net, I give Trump a slight edge over Biden, but the House Democrats a slight edge over House Republicans. For the U.S. Senate, Republicans are very likely to take the Senate. Not guaranteed, but they right now have 49 seats. They have not one incumbent member up for election this year, not one incumbent seat in a blue state, and only one in a purple state, and that's Florida, which is not really a purple state. So Rick Scott's not going to lose there. So Republicans will not lose any of their 49, period. They will gain almost certainly West Virginia. So now they're at 50. Out of all the other races that the Democrats have to defend, all they have to do is gain one more. I think they'll probably gain Ohio. Okay. Then they have a chance in some other states, maybe Pennsylvania, maybe Arizona, a couple others as well. My best guess is that the Republicans will probably net gain 3 seats and get up to 52 seats in the U.S. Senate. Narrow control of the Senate.
Okay. So toss up in the House, slight edge to the Republicans in the Senate, some conditional probabilities built in based on who actually wins. And I'm assuming that's just kind of the coattails effect.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So we're past the elections, and I guess based on either candidate for president winning, what's the likelihood that tax policy, or what are some of the changes that will likely happen to tax policy? Because as I understand it, I think individual tax rates, the tax cuts expire in 2025. Is that correct?
Basically, the individual side of the Trump tax cuts originally enacted in 2017 will expire at the end of next year, at the end of 2025.
Okay, so what happens under a Biden and then a Trump presidency?
Okay, so let's think about that. Rather than thinking Biden presidency, Trump presidency, I want you to think about 3 general possibilities. Okay. One is a Republican sweep. If the Republican sweep, they're basically going to extend the Trump tax cuts originally enacted 7 years ago for several more years. That's it. Okay? And they'll do stuff with tariffs, but in terms of regular tax law, income tax policy, stuff like that, just extend the Trump tax cuts. Simple, pretty clean. If there is a Democratic sweep, and by the way, I give a 35% chance, 35, to a Republican sweep. If there's a Democratic sweep, and I put those odds are about 20%, simply because the Democrats have such a tough time retaining the Senate that their odds are lower. Okay. That's the key factor in this election cycle. So with their 20%, if they sweep, they're not going to raise taxes for calendar year 2025. They're not going to do a retroactive tax hike like Bill Clinton did. And the reason they're not going to do that is because if they do that, then people have to pay their extra tax bills in April of 2026, which is 6 months before the midterm election cycle, which you don't want.
Right.
So what they will do is a series of other tax increases. It's going to be tax hikes galore. Okay. So the top tax rate, now 37, will definitely go back to 39.6. They might fiddle with the thresholds on that bracket and the other bracket, lowering those thresholds so it affects more income. The corporate rate, which used to be 35 pre-Trump, is now 21, left over from his tax cut. That's going to go up to 28%.
They have to raise that, though, right? Because isn't that permanent? That's
correct.
That's not one that expires.
That's correct. But if there's a Democratic sweep, they don't need any Republican votes to do this stuff.
Right.
None, because of the budget reconciliation procedures. So capital gains and dividends, I think there'll be many Democrats looking for 28%. It's going to go up, and it might go up that high. Okay. I don't think it would go above 28, but they're going to push it as high as they can go. I think the inheritance tax exemptions will shrink. Not completely to where they were back in 2017, but maybe go back halfway. And I also believe that they are either going to raise the gas tax, which would appease environmentalists, or in the alternative, do something that the Clinton administration toyed with temporarily in 1993, which is introducing a carbon tax. So that's a possibility as well. But there are massive deficits going on, as far as the eye can see. And we used to be in that age of candy when the interest burden of the debt was only 1.5% of GDP. Well, now it's next year after, it's going to be back to 3% like the 80s and 90s.
So, talk about the age of candy, because that's an interesting term. What do you mean by that?
I've been contrasting 2 eras. The 80s and 90s were the politics of limits, and then the past 20 years have been the age of candy. What is the age of candy?
I don't know, but it sounds amazing.
Yeah,
age of candy.
Some people call it the age of cocaine, but I've tried to stay away from the drugs. Okay. So what is the age of candy? It's an era from 2001 until this past year when the interest burden of the debt has been so low, roughly 1.5% of GDP, that politicians had a lot of money lying around to buy votes. So Bush cuts taxes in 2001, cuts taxes again in 2003, does a prescription drug benefit in Medicare, and then also embarks on a very expensive and discretionary war in the Middle East. Now, I'm not saying the war was right. I'm not saying the war was wrong, but it was discretionary and expensive. And then we have President Obama getting elected, and he enacts the first major expansion of entitlements since the 1960s. And then President Trump gets elected, and he cuts taxes again. So what do we get from both parties? Tax cuts and spending increases, big time. The politics of limits in the 80s and 90s was much, much different. Reagan came in 1981, passes a bill, the Congress passes a bill to cut income tax rates across the board. But what happened after that? 1982, we raised the payroll tax across the board for American workers. We have Graham Rudman Hollings, some people with gray hair might remember this, to limit federal spending growth in the mid-1980s. And then in 1990, Bush the elder goes out to Andrews Air Force Base and negotiates a budget deal with Senate Democrats and Senate and House Democrats to renege on his no new taxes pledge, raise taxes a little bit, and impose strict spending caps on both military and social spending alike, discretionary spending. And so Bill Clinton gets elected in 1992 on a promise explicitly about raising taxes. And he said it would only be on the rich, but we all knew he was lying, and he was, because he raised the gas tax too, which was on rich and poor alike. And he keeps the strict spending caps originally enacted under Bush the elder. So we ended up with like a 17-year period of zero net tax cuts. After 81. 81 was a tax cut, absolutely. We end up with a 17-year era of zero net tax cuts and multiple efforts to rein in the growth of federal spending. On a bipartisan basis, all of these measures. So I think once the interest burden gets back to 3%, 3.5%, over the next couple of years, we're going to go back to the politics of limits because politicians won't have the money around to buy votes.
So the age of candy, you think, is coming to a close, and we're
Yes.
the politics of limits and balanced budgets? Is that?
Not balanced.
Okay.
We're not going to see a balanced budget again for the remainder of any of our lifetimes.
Okay. Okay. Do you think that there's any point at which it just seems like, as a citizen, as we're thinking about, doing things that are responsible, that it would make sense to index tax brackets to inflation, or else you have that sort of bracket creep that is a sort of hidden.
Reagan did this. Since the mid-1980s, all income tax brackets have been adjusted for inflation.
So is that just based on CPI, or is that?
It's based on a slightly different measure than we normally talk about with the regular CPI, but it's similar.
As a result of that, the last couple of years, those lines must have moved up pretty dramatically.
Yes, they have.
All right.
Yes,
See,
they have.
This is why I love having you on the podcast here, Bob, because there's all sorts of things that...
I'm an encyclopedia of tax policy
Your knowledge
history
is encyclopedic. So we're heading into the election. When do the polls start getting priced into markets, whether equities, bonds? Is that, I think conventional wisdom is sometime in the summer. Is that what you think?
I think that's probably right, but I'm not sure how they should process that information.
Right.
Because they also have to be processing information about, like if there's a 35% chance of an extension of the Trump tax cuts and a 20% chance of tax hikes galore, how do you price that in? Like what? So I think whatever happens on election day, we have a chance for a lot of volatility right around then. The other thing to remember is, what if there's mixed government? What if there's, Biden in the Oval Office still, but the Republicans somehow retain control of the House and get control of the Senate? Well, then Biden might be willing to compromise on extending most of the Trump tax cuts, but not all of them. But what happens if you still have this House Freedom Caucus which says, we're not going to vote for it unless we extend every single element of the Trump tax cuts? Well, then whatever compromise results, if it's without their votes, has to be more tax hiking. So
it's counterintuitive.
Yes, it's hard to price in what's going to happen until you really know the results. And so because they're so diametrically opposed, what the tax policy results are. And so I think in the end, the market just kind of pedals along looking at earnings and interest rates and inflation and real economic growth until the election happens. So then it'll go out of control for
Then we'll have a little bit of volatility in November and December, perhaps.
Yeah.
I think one of the silver linings, kind of listening to that, if there is this mixed, the Republicans and Democrats have the presidency and they can't pass anything, that would probably mean that corporate rates would stay the same, right?
Yeah, but individual rates would go up quickly. And
individual rates would sunset
the inheritance tax exemptions would go way back down. So
again, things would be mixed.
Yes.
Right. Yes. All right. Well, this conversation has once again flown by. I appreciate you joining us. My final question for you is actually going to be the same final question I had for you last time, because I know you read a lot. You read a lot of books. A book a month, I think, is what you have mentioned before. Anything on the horizon on the Bob Stein reading list that we should be checking out?
I have on back order, actually back order is not the right word because I ordered it in advance. So I'm supposed to get it on February 20th.
Okay.
Which is a book by a gentleman named Rob Henderson.
Okay.
If you are on Twitter and want to follow somebody who's interesting and very insightful, that very few other people have heard about, you want to follow a guy named Rob Henderson. It's basically the story of his life and how he kind of made it out of some very trying childhood events and really came into his own.
Okay.
And he's extremely insightful. He has this belief about he's kind of coined a phrase, I think, about luxury beliefs.
Okay.
Luxury beliefs.
Is he an economist or is he?
No, not at all. He's kind of like a sociologist, which probably means academia won't hire him because he'll make all the left-wing sociologists look stupid. So here's the deal, 200 years ago or even 100 years ago, you could distinguish yourself as not being poor by the clothes you wore. But over the past 200 years, the cost of clothing has gone down so much that you could wear stuff that looks great for not much money.
Sure.
So you really can't, the aristocracy, the upper class, can't really distinguish itself by the clothes they wear. Hence, one result is they don't try to be too flashy in the way they dress. They want to show they don't have to dress flashy to some extent. Okay, CEOs walking around in fleece vests and stuff.
Yeah.
You want to be too flashy.
Yeah.
Because that says you're trying to show off your clothes. Right. But if you're really rich, you don't have to show off your clothes.
Yeah.
So what the rich have really done to distinguish themselves from the middle class and below is adopt belief systems that show that they're rich.
Interesting.
And so they care about issues and believe in certain takes on issues that the middle class and below don't have the luxury of, like supporting revolving door justice. People are caught with a gun in the commission of a crime, and they just let them out later that day. Oh yeah, I support that because I live in the suburbs, or I have enough money to insulate myself.
Sure.
These criminals are not attacking the people driving around with chauffeurs and then getting dropped off at Billionaire Row.
Right.
Okay, so you adopt luxury beliefs to show that you're not a part of the masses.
Interesting. It reminds me of some folks that may be against the Second Amendment that also have bodyguards that are armed that are chauffeuring them around.
That's exactly right.
They
could afford to not support the Second Amendment.
Interesting. Well, as I said, been a really interesting conversation. Thanks for coming on again, and we'll look forward to the third appearance of Bob Stein. Maybe later this year we'll be able to come back in. Thanks, Bob. And thanks to all of you for joining us on this episode of the First Trust ROI Podcast.